Hi, everyone. This is Bill Squadron. I'm the president of Our Energy Policy, and we're delighted to have you join us today for what I believe will be one of the most fascinating webinars that we've hosted to date on a topic that is critical and timely across the country. The issue of building electrification, converting America's building stock, all the economic, political, infrastructure issues around that. We have a really phenomenal panel to discuss that, and we're very fortunate to have Adam Zurofsky, who I'll be introducing in just a minute and turning it over to as our moderator. Before we jump in, first of all, thanks to all of you for taking the time to join us today, and thanks to our sponsors, our partners from Con Edison, Broadscale, US Grid, Schiff Harden National Grid, and BP, which is an underwriter of the series, for supporting what we've been doing here. What we're going to do is have a conversation that'll go until about 12:45, 12:50 Eastern time, and then we're going to open it up to questions from all of you in the audience. There is, as part of the GoToWebinar bar on the right, an area for questions. If you do have questions, please type them in, and we will get to as many questions as we possibly can before we break at 1:15 Eastern. But I will say this, we are going to, on the Our Energy Policy site, continue this discussion online. For all of you that would like to weigh in with your thoughts about what our panelists are going to discuss, other thoughts about this topic, we'll give you some more instruction at the end about how to get on that if you haven't participated in an OEP online dialogue to date. But we encourage all of you, and to the degree we're not able to get to every question, which sometimes is the case, there will certainly be opportunity to engage online through that discussion that we'll be posting on our site shortly after the webinar ends today. So again, thank you very much. With the news of the day, we certainly hope all of you are taking every possible precaution or staying healthy, both yourself and all of those in your friends and family and in your orbit are well and remain healthy. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Adam Zurofsky. I'm sure many of you know him as one of the leading figures in Governor Cuomo's administration up until very recently, now teaching at Columbia, but Adam was the Deputy Secretary for Energy, the leader of Governor Cuomo's implementation of his climate change program, and the director subsequently of state policy and agency management for the state of New York. We are very privileged to have Adam here today to moderate this discussion. And so I'm going to turn it over to Adam to get things started. Adam?
Well, thank you, Bill. Can you hear me okay? Great, thank you for that warm introduction, and welcome everyone. I just want to start at the outset to say thank you again to Bill and to Carolyn and to Kevin and all the folks at OEP, as well as the sponsors. This is just terrific opportunity for us to discuss what I think is a fascinating topic. You know, the OEP folks always do such a gracious and wonderful job, and usually it's accompanied by a very nice lunch at the Yale Club. Unfortunately, we can't do that today for obvious reasons. But the good news about that is that we get to have more time to have a conversation, and what's more, we get to have more people join us. I think we had 305 RSVPs for this event, which I think is the largest number, and notwithstanding the Yale Club's hospitality, I don't think they have enough room cocktail for that group. So at least we'll be able to have a broader group today. This is an exciting event, I think, on an important topic. It's obvious to say that there are a lot of buildings in the United States. The question is, you know, what we're going to be talking about here is the process and/or the opportunities and costs and challenges of electrifying buildings in the United States, and why do we care? Well, as of 2019, there were 140 million housing units in the United States, including 70 million residential homes. And they accounted for roughly 40% of our energy use in the country, 70% of our electricity. By most estimates, the emissions profile of the building stock is somewhere around a third for the United States, and is therefore one of the big three legs of the stool if you think about transportation, buildings, power generation, among others. And what's interesting to me about building stocks and electrification and decarbonization is not so much their importance. I think that's self-evident, and the fact that they would be a key pillar of any climate plan or energy transition, but rather the particular challenges and opportunities that they present. I mean, it's no surprise yesterday the Biden campaign announced a climate, jobs, and energy policy that had a heavy component, and a key component was buildings, right? That's not a surprise. But the question and the challenge, and I think what I'm looking forward to in the discussion today with our terrific panelists, who I'm going to introduce in just a minute, is digging into that. When I was at the state government working for Governor Cuomo on these issues, we always kind of joke that the building sector was the hardest of the three legs to solve. Why? It's pretty obvious. Every building is different. Every building has a different owner, different timeline, different equipment, different zoning laws, different different economics, different politics, whatever you want to call it, different contractors. There are so many factors to make each building unique, and therefore, unlike say in the power sector where you could say, okay, here are the X generation facilities, we're going to do a clean energy standard or something like that, which while it's difficult and challenging, nonetheless has the benefit of some clarity and you can get your arms around the problem. The building sector does not allow for that because of its unique and diverse and dispersed nature. So that, of course, presents challenges for policymakers. It presents challenges for folks involved in trying to make the building sector decarbonized. But it also presents opportunity. We're going to talk about both today. The one thing I just want to frame it up before I turn it over to the panelists is a little bit of a structure here. What we would like to do today is, rather than the typical discussion, sort of everybody just chimes in for 5 minutes on the topic, and then we go around Q&A, is do a little bit more what I'm considering an Oxford style discussion, and that is to say, put out a vision of what it might look like for an aggressive, massive building electrification set of policies and programs. Because in the past, we've seen attempts at different parts of it. The PACE program, which I had worked with here in New York State at some length, is trying to solve some of the financing issues. There's been other efforts around net zero codes for building codes. But I think we are really in need of in this country is a broad and compelling vision as to what the whole thing looks like. What are the machines that need to be changed? When? How? On what economics? Who's going to make those decisions? How does that flow through the workforce development and all the rest of it? And so I think we're lucky today. I'm going to start with Alex Laskey in a minute, who's the co-founder of an entity called Rewiring America, on which, in disclosure, I sit on the advisory board. But what they are attempting to do and are driving is to try to create that kind of broad vision. What a policy framework would look like to have a mass and aggressive electrification of the economy, in particularly the building sector. How would we do it? What steps we needed? What are the obstacles? And all the rest. And we're also, as I say, I want to make sure we're also going to focus on the benefits and opportunities here, not just job creation and economics, but also the opportunities for utilities and other members of the energy industry. What are the opportunities for labor? What are the opportunities for homeowners in terms of not just economic savings, but health benefits in getting rid of fossil equipment? And so we're going to talk about all that stuff. But what I'm going to ask Alex to do in the first instance, and as I'm going to introduce the panelists and then turn it right over to him, is to just give us a few minutes of what it looks like, a broad vision, and then we're going to go to each of the panelists and sort of have them, I say shoot, but I mean that in a positive way, give the pros and cons, the challenges and opportunities of that vision. But before we turn there, let me give you a little bit of each of on our terrific panel, which I want to thank each of them obviously for their participation today. Alex, who's now appeared up here, is a founder of OPower, which is now part of Oracle Utilities, and through a unique combination of data analytics and behavioral science, OPower helps the world's largest utilities transform their customer experience and help consumers save energy. He's also a co-founder, as I mentioned, of Rewiring America, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated towards envisioning and identifying what a policy framework looks like here, and we couldn't be happier to have him. It's nothing more timely than that. Also on the panel is Marilyn Brown. Marilyn is Regents Professor in the School of Public Policy at Georgia Tech. She joined Georgia Tech in 2006 after over 20 years at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, where she directed several national climate change mitigation studies and became a leader in the interpretation of energy futures. She is also, and this is exciting for me, I don't think I've ever moderated a panel with a co-winner of a Nobel Peace Prize, which she shared as part in connection with her work as IPCC in 1997. She has been just a leading writer and thinker on energy policy, and has also written extensively on the intersection between electrification and jobs, which we're going to get to today at some length. Speaking of jobs, Mike Fishman, my friend from my New York State government days, is without question in my mind he and his colleagues are the leading voice in the labor movement as to what it looks like and how to embrace the energy transition and climate change policy that we know is coming, and how workers can be a part of those solutions. He and I have worked together in many initiatives and from offshore wind to others, and it's a pleasure to have Mike here. He was in the past Secretary Treasurer of SEIU, founder of Climate Jobs, and is also, and we'll get to this, I hope, if we have time, working to take what they've done in New York, which has built a very robust but also engaged labor component to climate policy and discussions, and trying to get that across the country. So I'd like to get his thoughts later as well, not just what we've done in New York, but how we're going to think about this nationally. So I'm glad to have Mike here, as I am also just welcome Kyle Kimball, our old friend from Con Ed, and Kyle, obviously is representing in this capacity our largest utility in New York State, but he is the Vice President of Government, Regional, and Community Affairs. He directs the company's community and government relations in New York City, Albany, and Washington. And I know from personal experience is very thoughtful, thinking around policy issues and these issues. And we look to him, obviously, to give us some perspective from the utilities, both broadly and in New York in specific. So with that, let me turn to Alex, and let's get at it. As I say, we'll do point, and then we'll sort of bounce off of that, and then hopefully we can get the conversation going there and into some audience questions.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you to the folks from Our Energy Policy for hosting us with or without lunch. It's great to be with all of you, and it's great to be with such a great audience. Yeah, as Adam indicated, we started Rewiring America. We're officially launching next week, and we are launching with a analysis of the economic and employment opportunities that a rapid what we describe as a maximally feasible transition to electrification and decarbonization, what that looks like in terms of the job creation economic opportunities. So we will release that report next week, but we are going, I've shared with the Our Energy Policy team an embargoed copy, and you guys, all of you attendees, are welcome to a copy of that, so long as you promise to give us feedback, good, bad, and otherwise. We welcome that in the next couple of days as we prepare for a final release, and as long as you promise don't to share it with the press, because we're going to be releasing it. We're working with some journalists on stories now for next week. So I'm taking a leap of faith that we can share it with a large audience, and it will hopefully stay private. So what is it? What does the report look like, and what does our plan look like? As Adam indicated, we started. I partnered with Saul Griffith, who many of you probably are familiar with from his work, and he's been a sort of robust personality in this space. He's a MacArthur-winning engineer and physicist who's had a habit, maybe an unhealthy habit, for the last 20 years of studying energy data. And the analysis that he showed, commissioned by DOE and ARPA-E, is a really promising and exciting one. When you look at a much more granular level at energy flows through the U.S. economy, there's Adam indicated that a third of our emissions come from the building stock. His analysis actually suggests that a much greater percentage come from the building stock, and that's because there are a lot of things that we have characterized and accounted for as industrial uses of energy that are actually should be properly characterized according to their end uses. So I'll give you just a couple of examples on that, and I will take you through to the conclusion of that analysis. One example, and this affects transportation, is that 4% of all U.S. energy is oil being used to refine oil into gasoline. We think of that as an industrial use. We don't consider it an transportation use, but it has profound implications as we think about the consequences, the very positive consequences of electrifying our vehicle fleet. On the building side, 1% of all energy is natural gas that goes to pressure natural gas pipelines. 0.25% is diesel fuel carting coal from coal mine to coal plant. All these things add up, and if we think about a future in which we are decarbonized and fully electric, to the extent we can be fully electric, we don't have to do those tasks anymore. And so at the net, if you do no traditional energy efficiency, if we just rapidly decarbonize the economy, decarbonize the generation fleet, and then electrify everything else, we'll be in a world where we need 42 or 45 quads of energy rather than the 98 our economy survives on today. So we'll get the same torque in our pickup trucks, the same square footage in our homes, the same comfort with half as much energy as we electrify. So there's some really good news. And in doing that analysis, we decided, let's take it a step further to Adam's point and set the stage here of thinking about it. What does a climate policy look like that doesn't start from the sort of obscure down, from the gigatons of carbon, from the carbon pricing to climate science down, but rather from the machines up? What are the machines in each of those 130 million homes or buildings, the 76 million single family homes that Adam identified at the top of his talk, and the 250 million passenger vehicles? What are the machines from that level of granularity up, including, of course, power plants that emit carbon? And what do we need to do to replace them, as I said, in a maximally feasible way? So essentially replace everything that is carbon emitting at the time of its natural replacement. So we're not talking about accelerating retirements in our analysis, but simply what do we do at the time of retirement to replace everything that burns fossil fuels with something that is burning clean electricity? We are aware, of course, that there are certain small sectors of the economy, and they are relatively small, including air transport, shipping, that will need to be covered with something other than electricity, biofuels, for instance. But nearly 90% of the economy can be covered with electrification. So when you do that analysis, there's a lot of exciting news that emerges. One is, this quote is often attributed to William Gibson, although, as I understand it, may be misattributed, which is that the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. And as we look across the globe and we look to things like California electric vehicle policy, Australian rooftop solar policy, German heat pump policies, if we could bring those together in this country, we could rapidly decarbonize and in the process save Americans, by our calculation, roughly $1,000 to $2,000 a year on average per household. And let me give you a bit more specificity as to what that looks like. Our plan imagines a world in which electrifying your building stock, your home, as Adam described, one of the challenges here is that there are 350 or 130 million, depending on how you count it, decision makers that we have to influence. So how do we get them, each of them, to electrify their homes and in the process also electrify their personal vehicles? We imagine a future in which the electricity in Mike Fishman's house is dependent on the heat pump in Marilyn's basement to keep the lights on in Mike's house, and that the EV in Mike's car, the battery in Mike's EV is necessary as a grid resource to keep the lights on in Adam's house, and that the solar panels on Adam's roof are necessary in part to keep the lights on in Kyle's home. And we imagine that future, and that's not a difficult future to imagine, in which we all own shared infrastructure. So even if that infrastructure is owned by the Fishmans, the Browns, the Zurofskys, and the Kimballs, we should think of it as shared infrastructure, and we should do what we do with all infrastructure in this country, which is give it access to cheap government backstop financing to the tune of 3 or 4%. If you do that, and at the same time do two big things on policy front. So one is redefine infrastructure to include distributed electrification to make it more affordable than the alternative, because we already know that the lifetime cost of owning these electric devices is cheaper than the lifetime cost of owning the internal combustion alternatives. If you do that and you do other policy pieces, one is we deregulate local building code. So we make putting solar on your roof, we make electrifying your home less expensive than it is today. And one other piece, which is, and I'll return to that middle piece, but the third piece here is important, and lots of people have talked about this. We describe it as grid neutrality a la net neutrality. That is to say that no matter who owns the asset, the generating, storage, or demand side asset, whether it's the Zurofskys, the Kimballs, or if it's Con Ed or National Grid, it ought to be treated fairly and compensated fairly. On that middle section, I just want to underline, if you do that, you can save the average household $2,000 a year. And I want to describe briefly that middle thing because I want to make sure I'm clear about it. Rooftop solar in the US today is installed at $325 or $3.50 a watt. And so when financed, it's much more expensive than grid solar. In Australia, which has labor costs of a minimum $35 an hour, they're installing rooftop solar at $1.25 or less per watt. And they're doing it because they've cleaned up building code and made it much easier and much less expensive to facilitate permitting and inspection. If we did that in this country, financed, electricity you produce on your own roof would cost you roughly 6 to 7 cents a kilowatt hour. That's cheaper than the average cost of transmission in the US. And before Kyle responds quickly to this, even if we put rooftop solar on every home in the US and over every parking space in the US, we'd still need to double the size of the electric grid and double the work of the electric utilities, because by electrifying heating, hot water, and ground transportation, we're going to somewhere between triple and quadruple demand. Yeah.
I was going to let me jump in there for a second because I want to make sure, and we've got to come back to jobs in a second with Mike, but I want to just make sure. Marilyn, can we get you in here just for a second in terms of the vision Alex is laying out? What are the key policy drivers you see, and you know where the stumbles are going to be? Because I think we should try to frame. Let's try to get into that conversation if we can off of this. This is so much great stuff, but I want to make sure we get a chance to sort of go there. Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I wanted to start kind of big picture and historic and explain why it is that all electric homes and offices, buildings, and industry has been given such a bad rap. I mean, we all know about the environmental costs associated with generating electricity from coal, and it's my contention that has spilled over into giving fossil fueled appliances a bad rap. So there were policies and environmentalists whose view of the preference for gas appliances that has continued to drive that marketplace forward and made it difficult for the all-electric movement to progress. So we really need to come to grips with that. I remember when I was at the National Academy of Engineering Committee, I wrote a pamphlet with some others that showed that a lump of coal, the energy content of a lump of coal, by the time you turn the light switch on in your home to use that electricity, you are taking advantage of 3% of the energy embodied in that coal. It was so inefficient. And of course, you also lost, efficiency along transmission and distribution system. So just wanted to put that in perspective. All of that, of course, is no longer the case, especially in states such as the 29 that have renewable portfolio standards and many of the others with carbon reduction goals. They have much cleaner electricity. So forget that thinking. Put that all aside. We also have now a case where the consumer or the prosumer can be part of the solution. I really liked, Alex, your weaving us all together in this peer-to-peer marketplace, because I do see that as part of the next generation of where we're going. So if my PV system has excesses, rather than selling it back or losing it, I can power my water heater, or maybe I can send some over to Kyle or to Mike. So all of these exchanges, they're difficult right now. The policies are not in place and not able to allow these third-party aggregators to make a good business out of the ability to market as
Well,
pros.
Let's dig into that. What are the policies, Marilyn, you see that would help that? I mean, on that point, how do we get from here? What's moving that forward in your judgment?
Well, it depends on which electricity market you're in. Whether if you're in the traditionally regulated marketplace of much of the South, there you have the Territorial Act, for instance, which means that only certain companies, qualified facilities, can sell electricity. You and I can't.
Right.
So if we want to open up our garages, and if I want to be able to power your EV when my garage is empty from the storage that I have stored up there from the PV on my rooftop, I can't do it. I mean, I could physically.
Well, but what is the role? Is there a federal role, for example, in trying to harmonize the system? I mean, the NISO system and the difference that was all built at a different time. Is there? I mean, I'm not sure there's an answer, but asking, what would you do if you had an unlimited ability to sort of wave a magic wand? What would it look like to try to help that?
I'm not sure about the federal fix in each case. Unfortunately, some of these policies are implemented in legislation that's been passed by state legislatures. So yeah, sorry, don't know that we can manage everything from Washington in this case.
Well, it doesn't have to be. So yes, how do we do
it? We need to show the logic of all of this to the policy makers in America. We need a grassroots movement, I think.
Right. Let me turn to Mike speaking. One of the other aspects, and I know Alex has referred to the jobs report, and I think you've seen it. One of the things that's most interesting about this, and let's certainly stipulate to the policy challenges that Marilyn has identified broadly, but let's turn to the question of what should be don't need to be said, but probably is worth saying anyway, which is that one of the great things about buildings and putting in hot water heaters and PV and is that the people who have to do that are all almost by definition in America, right? No outsourcing of those jobs. They happen in each zip code because there's buildings in each zip code. They are in many cases, and I hope we get time at the end to talk a little about the current environment we find ourselves in, but they are in many cases the same folks, or many folks who are being displaced right now and facing economic hardship given our current difficulties in this country. What do you see as the opportunities and challenges here for workers in this sort of vision we're talking about of a shared, dynamic, electrified infrastructure? And then I guess the question is, backing up to what I asked Marilyn, what do you think needs to change from a policy perspective to bring about those opportunities and challenges?
So thanks, Adam, for throwing it to me. I just say a couple of things about what we're doing in climate jobs. Is that I'm working with a bunch of unions around the country that are serious about dealing with climate change and also dealing with the inequality crisis in the country and creating good jobs as we build towards addressing climate change. And we call that Climate Jobs National Resource Center. I should also say that I was the president of the union in New York that represented the building service workers. So we were intimately involved with the discussions about greening the buildings in New York City and across the East Coast. And there's so much in this proposal, and I've read the first white paper that Alex and his team put together. It's a great opportunity. We have to head towards electrification, and building a plan from the bottom up is exactly the way to go. It's great to set goals, but we have to have strategies to get there. And this proposal is a proposal that takes it from the bottom up, where you take the existing structure. And I like, Alex, where you say we're going to change as the changeover needs to take place rather than drive it all at once. I would say that the wartime analogy you use in your white paper is a good one, because this takes sustained effort in the public and private sector that really has to be driven by government. And whether it's government incentive or government regulation, we have to have government intervention to make this work. And that means also on the jobs. So specifically to your point, Adam, about the jobs, we have millions of workers now who are working in building industry. I would say, and Alex, you have this in your thinking, that those workers need to be able to transition and be part of this transition to the electrification. We think it's always a better plan and policy when you have the workers involved. And so those workers that are now working in this industry should be part of thinking about how you do this and how you do it economically. And those jobs that are created have to be created with good family sustaining wages. And again, you made that point about Australia where it's a $35 an hour minimum. We need some standards in this industry as we change. And those skills that are out there, we need to utilize and then train the current workforce to be able to transition into this new kind of technology, which is really, as you said, the future is already here. Many workers are already using these technologies and they're already in pieces of the industry, but we need to start building a training program for every worker to be part of the thinking on electrification and the installation and implementation of electrification in the building sector. It is true that every building is different, and that will be a complicated process. Every building has different finances, every building a different profit sector, every building different kinds of workers who are employed in the building and contractors who are working with them. And that's why we need the government to play a key and vital role here. And I think actually Vice President Biden's new proposal actually has some of that discussion in there about building training for workers, and not just training for the workers who are currently there, but the training for the workers who will be coming into the industry. So I think it's actually a really good start and good thought process and a bold vision. There's a couple of things that I would add just in terms of making it work. Right now, the financing structure for electrification or for climate change uses a lot of tax incentives. Tax incentives in the building industry generally are for the people who are making profits, and a third of the building stock is in the hands of either not-for-profits, government, or not profitable operations. And so we have to change our thinking about the kind of subsidies we would do that wouldn't just be tax incentives, which means that only the wealthier buildings and building owners could do that, but all buildings. If we're going to reach the, what did you say, 130 million buildings, if a third of that is not profitable or not for profit, we need to be able to incentivize that change as well. So I think that's where we need to go and think about good jobs as well as electrification and climate change at the same time, and then the regulations that need to be put in place to make that happen.
Let me ask you one question, Mike, before I turn to Kyle. I want to get to Kyle imminently, but I want to just one question for you. When you and I work together, right, in a different context, let's say the offshore wind context, one of the things I hope successfully did was trying to make sure and identify not just the policy side, but also, you know, the reality of the politics here. That is to say that folks feel, some workers, you know, feel displaced. They may not, you know, they may not be climate, who knows why. And I think I used to tell you a joke that, you know, the governor used to say out loud that we had 150,000 clean energy jobs in New York State, which was true. And then if you ask the second question, which is how many of those people actually know they're in clean energy jobs, they, you know, the number drops down to some minuscule fraction, right? And I think one of the things that we worked on in offshore wind was trying to identify what are the types of things where government could be helpful, ports or other things, and put some money to get buy-in from groups like labor, buy-in from groups, you know, get developers to put up money so it looks like it's a partnership, and it is a partnership between industry and labor. Are there aspects of this, admittedly more diffuse and broader program, that you see where there are opportunities for that kind of, let's call it this way, you know, circling the wagons politically and make sure everybody's working together?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely, as you and I have talked about, we need some kind of wage standards for all workers, and that includes obviously the unionized workers and the non-union workers. And we need to make sure that workers can participate in the decision-making on the job. You and I have talked about in New York using a wage board to set standards for the green industry. That would be something that would give people confidence that all this work would be done by people who are not only paid sustaining wages, but would also have access to training. All of that could be built into this kind of proposal that would give both unions and workers confidence that this would not be something that would end up with no careers and no jobs for a lifetime going forward. I think it's one of the things that is thought about but not said out loud is that in the utility industry now, the oil, gas, coal industry, those utility jobs have been thought of as careers. And when people think of the green economy and the jobs going forward, they don't think of them in the same way. And so the worry for working people is, well, this career that I've had my whole life is going away. What's my career going forward? And we have to start thinking of it that way. Is what is a life-sustaining job, a family-sustaining job going forward, that it's going to be not just a one-off, but it's going to be a career. And I think, Alex, in the proposal, you have a couple of numbers about the jobs it takes to get there and the jobs that will be sustained for the long haul. And I think we have to define that in a much more detailed fashion. What are those jobs? Just what you're saying, Adam. Who's included in this job, these jobs going forward, and what's the specifics of that we're talking about?
Adam, can I jump in and comment on something?
Go ahead, then I'm going to bring you. Go ahead.
Not much, just a short comment. You mentioned that a lot of the people working in the industry, clean energy industry, don't even know they are. Yeah. And one reason is because some of them are indirectly or very passively sort of contributing. For instance, you have a number of jobs that are directly employed in HVAC. You have the indirect employment come from the manufacturing of the HVAC equipment. And then you have the induced employment, which comes from the energy cost savings by using a more efficient system. So somebody who's now able to go out and buy a new car, or you can go out and you can buy a new wardrobe, that's me. Or you can spend your money differently. We don't think that you're in Target spending more money now because of the HVAC energy efficiency purchase, right? But that all three of those have to be considered, and they're much bigger. The indirect effects of clean energy investments are so much bigger than the indirect effects of fossil fuel production and consumption. I just wanted to throw that out. I know Alex and Mike know all of it.
It's such a big idea and such a big part of our physical landscape and economic landscape that it's impossible to not think about all of those concentric circles here. Kyle, let's talk about utilities. And I guess what I want to ask you is, there's the obvious role for utilities in this, which is to say the demand for electricity, perhaps the diminished demand for natural gas and all of that. There's probably the logistic challenges that we hear from you about in terms of generation, transmission, delivery, all those things. But I also wanted to ask you, and I guess I'm just load all three and let you respond to them as you think. What are the other opportunities for folks in your business? I think you and I have talked in the past about when you think about the diffuse nature of buildings, you think about having to touch each customer in a unique way to that customer's building and that customer's needs. And one of the few people that actually has those relationships and those touch points is their utility, who they think of as the power company. So I'm wondering, both in terms of the actual bread and butter business that you guys have is delivering power that would meet these kind of demands and being able to traffic in that business, and then also what role, if any, you might be able to play on some of this squaring up of the diffuse landscape that we're trying to get our arms around. So please take them in whatever order, but I think those are two really important parts of the world here that you guys.
Sure, I'll start with that last one just because it's top of mind. I think that many utilities are facing this question of disrupt or be disrupted, and I think many utilities are further along the curve than others in thinking about what its role is in delivering this clean energy future. One of the things I think we realized at Con Edison, and I think other I would say more progressive companies on these issues, is realizing that although we are not the policymakers that are making these decisions, that's why we have elections, we at the end of the day are the ones sending the bill for the policies. And so whether or not we are in the state legislature or not, we are the owners of these clean energy goals. And that's something I think we realized early on, that we have to be a part of the solution, that sitting back and letting these things happen and reacting is really not going to be part of the long-term future. So the business opportunities, I think, are really diverse depending on where you are on that spectrum and delivering those futures. We have, I think, been somewhere in the middle of the spectrum in terms of very focused on energy efficiency in terms of the consumer. So going one of the principles, of course, is just carbon reduction is just using less and using it more efficiently. So we've made a lot of investments in energy efficiency with our customers. But obviously the questions around reliability, what role does carbon play in reliability going forward in an electrified future, with black start issues, with the intermittency issues. Other business opportunities are around batteries. Batteries are a huge part of the solution for this. It's not just about generation, but really dealing with the intermittency of the renewable resources.
Does that bring us back to work, by the way, to Marilyn's point earlier about batteries as being, qualifying in wholesale market? And we don't have to get into too much of the regulatory, right? But that brings
right. And I would say that's one area that really, right. I think particularly in New York, needs a much more intervention in terms of making that market work. But then at the end of the day, there's also questions. So there's questions around the business and what touch points can you do to deliver this future, whether or not that's smart meters, of which we're doing, and most utilities have done at this point, increasing the ability of the consumer to understand how much energy they're using, giving them the tools to make smarter choices in the energy that they're using in terms of time of use pricing, being able to manage your energy use on your phone, all those kind of things. Those are the innovation that utilities are going to have to bring to customers. I think all of that wraps up though into a larger question that I have found that for the most part, becoming an energy person only in the last few years, and then talking to people who are not energy people about what's going on. For the most part, I think one of the biggest things we have to deal with as an industry, and it's not really about the people on this phone, it's about who the people on this call are talking to, is the question of not just taking energy for granted. If you ask people, everyone wants a low carbon, clean energy future. If you ask them how much they're willing to pay for it, it's probably not much. And so we have to really think broadly about where their indifference curves are in terms of what they're willing to pay for this clean energy future. How do you bring innovative solutions that bring down those costs? How do you do all of these interventions in terms of investing in the system through an equity lens and make sure that you're not implementing regressive taxes on buildings? There's so many questions.
That's a great point. And I'm going to come back to, what Alex brought up before, which is there's a finance role there, and maybe I'll open this up to the panel, for government to play to help, if seen as infrastructure and as seen as part of these things, low cost financing. Is there a role, let me start with you, Kyle, for Con Ed and its whatever financial situation and business opportunity to be a part of that with its customers to try to help them, because if it's true, and let's just posit that it is for the moment, just for the sake of discussion, that once you get past the capital hurdle of these types of electrification, there are savings down the line, meaningful savings, on average $1,000 to $2,000 a house, but not distributed uniformly, of course. Then if the challenge is a capital problem, right? There's obviously government policies that can be there, but is there a role, given your customer relationships and the way you guys have gone about it, and we should talk about this, for you guys as a business opportunity there too, to get us past that hurdle so those savings can be reaped, and obviously the business opportunities for you guys in terms of selling electricity and all the rest of it going along with that, right? So is that something you guys are thinking about or not?
I think on-bill financing thing is something we've talked about. It has its its pluses and minuses.
Right.
You have to remember, utilities are used to moving electrons around, not necessarily are not in the banking business. So maybe there's partnerships to be done. We have done some work on the energy efficiency side and around the financing, and but it's separate apart from the retail experience and the companies going further along the spectrum and financing investments and building retrofits or owning the solar on someone, renting someone's rooftop.
Right.
So right now you have to go out and figure this all out yourself as a homeowner. Could utilities show up and say, hey, we want to rent your roof and we'll do it all for free and we'll take responsibility for it? That's absolutely something that a utility could consider. Yeah. But one thing I would say, best thing I want to say is one of the points at the top in terms of the ground up approach. My only concern about that is I obviously think you need to have an educated consumer, and part of that is understanding what it's going to take to retrofit a building. I do think though that if the electrification happens too quickly, the upstream interventions that have to happen in terms of distribution investment, transmission investment, generation investment, to make sure that you are not electrifying into a dirty grid. You have to make sure that those are all happening in sync. Because if you electrify too quickly, you could be actually increasing the carbon footprint. And so I think they do have to move in tandem, but that all kind of goes up to a larger point around this has to be done intentionally. And it has to be done in a coordinated way that involves educated consumers and really making some pretty hard decisions around the role of carbon in the future.
If I could add,
I was going to come back to you on jobs. Go ahead, jump in there.
To that last piece, the good news, there's a lot of good news here, and we are, of course, all of us faced and bombarded with a lot of bad news, so it's nice to be reminded of the good news. The good news here, to your last point, Kyle, last year, 72% of all new generation across the US was zero carbon generation. That number is only going up, and so everywhere in the country, if you plug in your electric vehicle, it is cleaner than a gasoline alternative, and nearly everywhere in the country, save a couple of states, an electric air source or a ground source heat pump is less carbon emissive than a natural gas alternative. So the good news is that's already in happening. I agree, though, that we need to have this both happen in a coordinated way and trans-sectorial way. Like, one thing I want to mention here is that, you know, this is a conversation about buildings, and I think it's the most important topic, but I think we give ourselves short shrift by not including the EV automakers in this discussion. And I'll just point to one specific data point. If we put rooftop solar on buildings at $1.25 a watt, we end up in a world in which your EV is costing you 2 cents a mile to drive because the 6 cents kilowatt hour solar you're producing. Whereas today, even at $2 a gallon of gasoline, which is a lot less than we've seen in years, your 25 mile per gallon car is still costing you 20 to 30 cents a mile to drive. So having the EV folks in conversation with the building folks could do us a great service. I want to say one other thing about the utilities, which is I spent 10 years working with utilities, both on the electric and gas side, at helping them build stronger relationships with their customers. I think there's a tremendous business opportunity, not only for the electric utilities, but also for the gas utilities. The gas utilities have a lot to gain by helping their customers make this transition and not be fully disrupted. I'm struck, I know we're taking pace theoretically in New York today, but I had a conversation with Ralph Izzo once, the CEO of PSE&G in New Jersey, who he shared with me that for 900,000 people in New Jersey, PSE&G had the keys to their home, literally the keys to their home, because their gas meters were inside the house and PSE&G employees had to be let in to read the gas meters. There is not a single other entity, the government or any other company in the state of New Jersey, where the people of New Jersey would entrust the keys to their home. And so that kind of trust, even though utilities aren't always beloved, the kind of trust enjoyed both by the electric and the gas utilities can and ought to make them a terrific and very important partner to making this transition happen.
Let me know that's obviously there's so much in unpack there to it. We're mindful of the time that we want to turn over to questions from the audience in just a minute, but I wanted to just make sure this was out there. I think you mentioned this, Alex, but I want to just make sure Mike and the analysis that you're talking about suggests that a mass and aggressive transformation, electrification, will produce upwards of 25 million jobs over the next, 10 to 15 years, and then 5 million jobs sustained afterward. Mike,
new jobs. That's inclusive of job loss.
Mike, I'll start with you, and then Marilyn, I know you because you've done a lot of work in this space. Are those numbers sound right? I mean, that seems to me, in addition to the carbon savings and the potential savings we talked about in the energy bills, you know, that's given what we're going on in the world right now, and it's a tremendous opportunity too here on an economic development perspective. So I just don't know. Maybe I'll start with you, Marilyn, then you, Mike. Those numbers sound right, even directionally.
Yeah, Alex's numbers are very consistent with my published numbers from the Scientific American article in 2019 and an article in Applied Energy in 2020. They're all public domain open access articles. I hope you'll all take a look at them. You know, millions of jobs. Yes. And part of it is because of this multiplier effect and the job intensiveness of energy efficiency compared to the supply side. It's not really driven by jobs so much in solar and wind. Those jobs are not as energy intensive as efficiency, but when you're massively deploying any new resource, there's going to be a job boost benefit. I wanted to be absolutely sure that we did, however, put an overlay of equity and inclusion, because the nature of much of this, I like how you talk about it as machines. These machines, they tend to be in the homes of owning, affluent households, for instance, or the more less capital strapped businesses. So we've got to talk about what the machines are that are being driven in low income and in rented homes. So they're not their dishwasher use, their dryer use. It's not the thing. They really need a smart thermostat. They can afford that, or we can help them afford that. They're on their phone. They can watch what they're doing. And there are lots of smart gifts that we need to be sure they all have. The use of green leases, so that the arrangements that they make with their landlord is going to be supportive of that landlord having rooftop solar.
Well,
and
the
having
progressive part of that, right? The progressive part of that is making sure that the savings and the efficiencies flow through to them on a burden basis for rent and other reasons. Mike, just coming back to the I want to open up. I know they want to open up to questions from the audience. Numbers sound right to you on jobs and boys. Doesn't that justify going forward?
They do sound right, and I do think it justifies going forward. I mean, if we think about what's going on in the country right now with the pandemic recession, how do we rebuild? And $1 invested in infrastructure of this kind produces $2 of economic activity. To Marilyn's point about equity and inclusion, this is work that's done in people's homes in their communities and can be done by the people in those homes and in those communities, and can be shared wealth in that community. And we have to think of it that way. And training our workforce can do it.
Yeah, it's the other side, right? So the progressive side is both the savings in the home, but also the opportunity on the income side to then. Let's do this, which is let's go to the questions. I could do, we're all kind of bouncing in. Let's go to the questions and we can try to work in this stuff. Kevin, do you want to jump in and give us some questions from the audience? Because I know we have a lot of folks on the line here.
Thanks, Adam. Yep, we do have a lot of questions coming in already. Reminder to our audience, on your GoToWebinar interface, you can use the tab questions to enter a question for our panel. We'll add it to the queue and get through as many as we have time for. So jumping right in, first question to Mike from Jim McDonnell. When thinking about job creation, to be objective, should the analysis be on a net basis, meaning job losses should be included with job gains? Jobs lost in the coal mining and power generation industries come to mind. Is this the way you think of it?
I do think of it generally in that way, but I think of those jobs as transitioning into something new, and that's the discussion we have to have. I think we have to transition to a cleaner economy, and that means we have to create the jobs to do that, and that means some people will be replaced, and we have to deal with those people and those communities. And it's a very specific conversation about what happens to those communities that are affected, what happens to those people. The thing that's great about building sector, again, is it's in everybody's community. And if we think of this as long-term employment as you make the transition, it puts a lot of people to work in those communities doing good job, good work, smart work, skilled work that can create new opportunities for those who are losing jobs in the sector. And I think that's where the investment is worth it now.
To close that loop, so Alex and Marilyn, for you guys who've done this analysis with these numbers we just talked about before opening up, are those numbers that you put out, the 25 million and the 5 million and all the rest, are they net? Did they take account of that and should?
Absolutely. The supply side job losses are considered. The number of employees in coal mining in the U.S. today, I can't remember the latest, but it's like 60,000 or something like that. So we're not talking about much of a difference there, but everything is always net, definitely.
I think you brought Alex.
I was going to say every job, and also every job matters. A job lost to somebody, it doesn't matter to that person that there are 10 jobs created elsewhere. So we need to make sure that we do everything possible to make sure there is an equitable and just transition here. To put these numbers in context, the way that fossil fuel energy jobs are classified today, there are 2.7 million of them, but 900,000 of those people are people working in gas stations. And essentially, the gasoline is a loss leader, and they're making money selling corn syrup, tobacco, and
Hot dogs.
Liquor.
hot dogs. So I won't go into what hot dogs are, but yes. And so those jobs still will exist. There are a lot of jobs. And the other thing in our policy, we're not talking about early retirement. There is a lot of work still to be done at maintaining fossil infrastructure in the home and in the distribution networks. And those workers are well positioned to make the transition too. Just one quick thing on the scale of this, and you asked about the numbers. If you look at it, the last time our country faced a challenge like the one we're in today, at the dawn of World War II, unemployment had gone from 20% to 15% because of all the Franklin Roosevelt WPA programs, but it dropped from 15% to 1% in the Arsenal of Democracy buildup. It was the addition of 17.5 million jobs to a labor force of 53 million people in 1939. We're talking about 25 million net new jobs to a labor force that's 3 times as large. So this is the kind of thing that we have done before to get Americans back to work. We've tackled a big, ambitious challenge. We've done it in a way that leads us both to victory, but also to wealth and prosperity for a much broader set of Americans than have it today. And that's a future that I look forward to living in. So I'm excited about it.
You bet. Kevin, next one. Let's keep them coming.
Sounds good. Next question here is from Joanna Newman. Would the projection of electrification tripling or quadrupling demand take into account any improvements in efficiency or demand response?
Yes, on demand response, a little bit less so on efficiency, aside from the efficiency itself that comes from electrification. But obviously, efficiency would additionally reduce that. But there is, in any case, going to be a significant increase in demand as we transition non-electric demand to electric.
And Kyle, do you want to jump in there? Because obviously that goes right to the heart of your business too.
Sure. So here in New York City, we are a 13,000 megawatt peaker in the summer. And our predictions are anywhere from 2 to 3 times that as a winter peaking utility in the city, given the density, given that most buildings in the city are heated with furnaces in the basement. So a significant intervention would have to be made in the building stock here to transfer that heating load. But yeah, so and the concomitant distribution system improvements, given that New York City is primarily underground infrastructure. So the idea of doubling or tripling, because we have to be able to meet peak at any given moment, we also have to have the capacity for the system to rest at times, because it can't be at 100% all 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So you really have to build a system that can meet that heating demand on the coldest days of the year and make the investment. And that's 2 or 3 times what we're doing now.
And just to bring us, not to be too provocative, but that brings us back at some level, Marilyn, to the point you were making before. Does that raise the possibility that our regional system with ISOs and deregulated here and regulated there and all the rest of it may have been a system for a different time or not? And I'm not taking a position on that, but it seems like one of the ways to square what we're talking about, and Kyle and Alex just mentioned in the heart of the question, is thinking more interactively around demand and resources in a broader geographical area. I know there's all kinds of issues with that, but is that something that, maybe on the table in your view, given what we're talking about here?
Yeah, well, I do think that the availability of distributed resources, both on the supply and the demand side, is going to really help to manage the utilities peaking problems. And I don't think that it's currently being, that part of the equation, that part of the solution is barely been experimented with. It has been used, by the way, if you look at the Netherlands and then the UK, lots of great programs where the prosumer is a much bigger part of the solution and helps the utility to meet their peaking. Why do we have to build so many power plants so that on the 10 hours of the year that you need them, they're run? It's so inefficient. It's such a wasted expenditure of capital that could massively be spent in a more distributed fashion.
So that's a yes?
Yes.
That's a yes. Okay. All right, we got a yes. Kevin, next.
Well, we have had a few questions come in on this topic, Rob Watson and Terrence Hill. So I'll ask one, and then if the panel could kind of expand a little bit to make sure we cover our bases. As we were discussing building electrification, we should discuss AC versus DC, taking native DC from PV, converting it to AC for transmission, and then back to DC for native DC, uses such as computing, LEDs, motors, etc., add significant cost and significant energy losses. What proposals do you suggest to make sure that we are plugging into the right system?
So let me just jump in before we let's turn over the panel. That for those of you who wonder about the quality of the discussion at Our Energy Policy, you know, the fact that we are at that level here, this is just speaks to the value of this audience, this intelligence of this audience and this panel, because I'm going to let other people handle that one. But yes, that is a terrific question, but it really is getting to the heart of the nuts and bolts here of what we're gonna have to do rather than just aspirational. So I certainly welcome the question, and I don't know, maybe Kyle, you start, because Marilyn, because you guys are versed in this, or Alex, if you want to talk to those things, you know, jump in, guys. But what a detailed question.
Sure, go ahead, Marilyn.
Well, I don't know the answer. I do know that it's worth examining the pros and cons. It is a big investment requirement to change the DC AC/DC conversions in our system.
Right.
Yeah, and I would say that it could take it along two lines, right? There's the efficiency of the transmission that's important to take into account versus the end use. So I think it is a question worth considering. I think it all sort of levels up though to what level of investment are we willing to make a choice like that. And it sort of goes into the, you know,
Versus the payoff,
when you're
right?
creating
Yeah.
right, there's a trade-off between potentially more efficiency versus we're adding potentially something else to when you're thinking of the sources and uses, when you're building out this intentional plan, this is, you know, potentially another use.
Alex, anything to add on that before we go to the
Only that I wish Saul was here to answer the question, and I think the likely answer is a yes and. Like, we are going to triple the size of, you know, somewhere between triple the size of the grid and triple and quadruple the size of electric demand. There will be cases where it makes sense to go just DC to DC, and there will be other cases in which it makes sense to do this inefficient conversion. And we should think about this. We can't think about the U.S. as a monolith or our grid as a monolithic system. It will vary in locality and in time and space. So it'll be exciting stuff to tackle.
Okay, Kevin, something a little less, you know, more touchy-feely.
Let's see what we can do for you here. Next question is from D. Scott Peterson. How will investors in natural gas utilities be compensated for the hundreds of billions of dollars of installed infrastructure rendered useless by electrification? And who will pay for that decommissioning?
I'm no longer an officer, I'm not touching that one. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that. Is there some?
I can take that. I think that it goes to this question of, it sort of depends. It also depends on the investors and what kind of company you've invested in, dual fuel, you know, triple play, vertically integrated investor, or a gas only utility. But I think, without specifically answering the question, I think it's the larger question is, if we have an orderly transition and an intentional transition as opposed to a piecemeal transition, a lot of these will be incorporated into the cost of the decommissioning of the natural gas assets. Will be incorporated into the larger equation. So I think it's incumbent that you know, investments have been made, or potentially will be made, depending on the utilities. Some utilities have see the writing on the wall. Gas utilities have seen the writing on the wall and have begun their own process of decommissioning the gas business. But I do think that it does call into question how orderly the transition will be, making sure that customers are not hit with an accelerated depreciation bill, that there's already so much pressure on the bill for customers now. When you add in transmission, when you add in generation, when you add in distribution investments, when you add in potential, you know, financing costs or other things that are being financed in the bill, in addition to accelerated depreciation of gas assets, you know, it's a lot of pressure on customers. So it calls for an intentional and orderly transition too.
It is, by the way, as you all know, a very timely question. We have many pipeline projects now that are under debate, and we need to be cognizant of, like you say, if they go forward and they're not needed, who picks up that tab?
Well,
so that's the question now is very, very timely.
Yeah, let me jump in there though. I mean, I sort of ducked it in the first instance because obviously, for the reasons you're saying, Marilyn, that it is a political hot potato at the moment. I'm an investor in many different things, and I'd certainly take that perspective. But I would like to make sure that it's said out loud that question, interesting as it is probably a second order consideration and priority, right? As far as I'm concerned, we have workers, millions of workers who are displaced. We have from different things who were being transitioned out by an evolution that they had nothing to do with. We have a planet that is increasingly facing crisis around climate. We have an energy sector that's rapidly transitioning, and I'm certainly not in any way arguing that anyone should get stiffed in the process. We should be fair all around. But I don't think that's the kind of, I just think, speaking as someone who was a policymaker and may again someday be one, I can't see that being the heavy part of the scale, even if it has to be a part of consideration, because there's lots of people in the history of American capitalism who have made bets and put things in a way that ended up the future ended up moving past them. And I'm not necessarily making any judgments there. I'm just pointing out that when you're weighing the costs and benefits and a policy perspective, it seems to me there are bigger fish to fry than that one at the moment, even if that is a relevant one. So there, I said it. Anyone else want to jump in on that issue?
The only thing I would say is that there is the issue of tax incentives that are in place that are already in effect being used to pay for these kinds of investments, and those are direct. They're taken directly off the tax bill of a corporation, and so there are ways that are already being in place that are already being paid for this kind of transition. Even when there's some equipment that's not going to be used, it's built into the cost and into the incentives that are already out there in some ways.
And there's nothing to say, by the way, that couldn't be some innovation. I don't have the answer at this point, but having a pipe through a dense network, maybe it's not filled with gas anymore, but I think there is something to be said for brighter minds than mine figuring out what else could go in those pipes. Do you use them for broadband infrastructure? Again, I'm thinking about it very simplistically, but there's two components of the distribution system. One, there's the basic infrastructure that's been laid in the streets, and then there's the commodity that's flowing through it. If you're getting rid of the commodity going through it, it doesn't necessarily mean that the infrastructure that's still in the street is worthless.
And that's a great point, because we talked about power plants that are, fossil generating that may be retired. Well, they also have interconnections into the grid and could basically serve as battery. When you're thinking about utility storage, those are opportunities, things like that. So yeah, repurposing obviously would be part of it. Kevin, you got another one for us?
Sure do. We have a question here from Bob Cattell. The majority of the older buildings, particularly in NYC, are heated by boilers using natural gas or oil. Many in the NYC Housing Authority buildings. Some may even be on the Con Ed steam system. How do you deal with electrification of these boilers?
There's some. I'll just go quickly. There's some exciting developments in that front. There's a company that's Brooklyn-based, Block Power, that is quickly working with Con Ed, working with the City of New York, quickly electrifying old gas and oil furnaces in the South Bronx and across the city, and there will be other companies doing the same. The technology exists to do this, and this points actually to one other thing the gas companies can do with those pipelines. Their gas company has three big assets. They have a balance sheet, they have the customer relationships, which I already pointed to and Adam alluded to, and the third thing is they have this infrastructure that Kyle talked about. There's no question that in a place like New York, there's the opportunity to do district heating, a la what happens in lots of places in Europe, and using those existing rights of way and pipelines to provide warm water to people's homes and to big multi-family buildings or big office buildings on which you can run efficient heat pumps. There's a huge opportunity for somebody, and the gas companies are incredibly well positioned to make hay there. So,
you agree?
Solve that problem.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening with NYCHA. It's probably a panel into itself, what's going on there and the opportunities for distributed generation, for electrification. The concern generally has always been around NYCHA that it's a significant amount of capital, which if there's any type of intervention, and of course, there's obviously very scarce capital flowing to NYCHA as it is, let alone these large interventions that are placed. But there is a tremendous amount of opportunity. And in New York City, there's obviously two types of steam, right? There's steam that's generated by Con Edison, that's a district steam system in and of itself, that is in many ways helping the city to already avoid a tremendous amount of carbon to begin with. So we're starting day zero because we have a steam system in New York City down relative to another city that didn't have a district steam system in terms of carbon not being produced. So do you extend that to do you extend that to nitrogen developments that are within reach of the steam system? And again, that's transitioning to no carbon. Then you have to a low carbon, and then you have the issue of how that steam is produced in the first place, which is still done by natural gas at this point. So then, do you electrify the generation of that district steam system? Those are all. So there's a lot going on in that space that's exciting.
Kevin, we probably have time for one more. I'm looking at my clock. We always like to end on a high note. Anything on job opportunities or economic opportunities, or how this would be beneficial even no matter what the election or anything like that? Give us something good that these guys can all smile about on the way out.
Well, we have had a lot of questions come in regarding fee and dividend and an organized transition here. So I guess I'll throw out that question for you to kind of touch on. Could a carbon fee and dividend policy help drive our transition to an electrified economy while ensuring that the higher costs that may result do not hurt middle and low income households?
I'd like to introduce the idea of regional disparities in response to that, because my look at fee and dividend systems has shown that if you're in a region that has a tremendous, has a lot of carbon in its energy system, such as generating electricity, and you impose a fee and collect dividends, you're going to end up having a situation where the ratepayers' electricity rates go up in those regions with a lot of carbon, and the dividends are typically national, same per household or whatever. It ends up being a significant exchange of wealth from those high carbon regions to low carbon, mostly edges of the US, over to the East Coast, over to the West Coast, from the Southeast and the Central States. So just from a big picture, we have to be very careful about that issue of equity. I think it can be managed. I do, but I haven't seen much discussion of it.
Alex, what's the role of carbon pricing? I guess that's what we're talking about here fundamentally.
I think the time for carbon pricing as the only solution has passed. We can't move the market quickly enough with a politically feasible carbon pricing. I think we're also, though, the good news here is we're in a place where there is a positive investment case that doesn't rely on taxes, but that relies on helping people make these capital investments, whether they are low income renters or the wealthiest amongst us. That getting people access to what is already market competitive and cost savings infrastructure for their homes will save people money, allow them to breathe cleaner air, have more reliable fuel costs for their homes, their cars, et cetera. And we should be a positive message.
I see Bill, so I'm gonna ask one rapid fire exit question to everybody, okay? And Bill, you can chime first. You can chime in if that's too. 1 word, 2 word, 3 words, whatever. What excites you most about the possibilities of what we talked about today? I'm going around.
Who are you starting with? Addressing climate change.
Go ahead, Mike, I see you.
Climate change and creating jobs to recover from the pandemic that we're now in, the recession.
Okay. Marilyn, Kyle, anybody?
I like the making consumers part of the solution.
Okay.
To electrifying their homes.
25 million jobs is exciting. And I think given the extent of interventions that happen up in New York City, they could all happen here. But a significant portion of those jobs will happen in New York City.
A lot of waitresses retrofitting heat pumps, right? Alex.
I think I look forward to a world of continued abundance and prosperity, but a world that is much more habitable for us and for other creatures living on this
And
planet.
I'll take the last word and then go turn it to Bill and say that for me, what's exciting about this and why I think this is, I really appreciate everybody's time today, and this has been a great discussion, is watching and thinking about policy on important issues like climate and energy, but thinking it through the lens of multiple disciplines for the benefit of workers, for health benefits for people, for transforming an industry and bringing everybody together. I mean, that's certainly what I always try to do with my in my policy making, but I also think for challenges of this scale, with this kind of impact, it's the only way, and I think our discussion really reflects that today. So that's exciting to me. Bill, we're done. We ran by 1 minute over. I'm sorry, my friend.
No, it's a great segue and it's a positive ending. I think you all sketched out a vision for an infrastructure that's a really positive view of the future, where it's good for the economy, good for communities, good for our climate, drives jobs, and that's something we can all aspire to. So I want to thank all of you. I mean, individually, Adam, Alex, Marilyn, Kyle, Mike, I mean, you guys did a great job. Thank you for a terrific discussion. I'd like to also thank all of you who are online. The questions you came in, we weren't able to get to all the questions, but I do want to remind you, we're now going to essentially extend the conversation online. Go to the Our Energy Policy website. It'll be up by this afternoon, and weigh in with your thoughts. If you didn't have a chance to ask a question or had observations or comments, and it may even be that some of our panelists will get into the online conversation too if you've got specific things for them. So please do that. I'll also put in a quick plug for our Energy Library, which is another program we offer to all of you. The kinds of things like the white paper that Alex referred to, which will be up when it's public, Marilyn's articles in that library. So we absolutely encourage you to use these services. And lastly, I just want to once again thank our partners, BP, National Grid, Broadscale, Con Ed, Schiff Harden, and US Grid for their support. Finally, thanks to all our panelists and to all of you out there. Stay safe, stay healthy. Have a great rest of the week. Thanks again.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thanks,